11th century CE. A group of hardened desert warriors called the Almoravids burst out of the Sahara and managed to unify the entirety of Northwest Africa under the banner of Islam. In 1085, as the Catholics pushed south to capture Toledo, the emirs of the surrounding kingdoms sent a desperate call for help to Yusuf Ibn Tashfin, the supreme commander of the Almoravids. Yusuf Ibn Tashfin answers the call in 1086. He prepares his armies and heads up north to fight Alfonso VI in what will become the legendary Battle of Sagrajas. The losses inflicted on the Catholics are so significant that it will set the Spanish Reconquista back by some 400 years. But this is a longer story, so sit tight and relax as I tell you the incredible history of the Almoravid Empire. Let us now go back in time. 974 CE. The leading Idrisid dynasty has just fallen, and a period of intense instability, chaos, and tribal warfare plagues the region. Enter Yahya ibn Ibrahim. Yahya ibn Ibrahim is the first person recorded in history to unify the ranks of the Moroccan tribes after the fall of the Idrisid dynasty. He comes from the Gudala tribe and is the de facto leader of the bigger Senhaja tribe of Morocco. Yahya was a man of ambition. As a tribe leader, he felt immense sorrow at the complete decline of morals the country suffered. But this would be no more. In 1038, he travels to Mecca with two goals in mind: accomplish his Islamic duty of Hajj, and look for someone who would help him achieve his dream of a united entity. On his way back, he stops by Qayrawan and meets Abu Imran al-Fasi, a jurist from the Maliki school, and is immediately impressed by the scholar's knowledge, manners, and asceticism. He tells the scholar about the situation back in Morocco, the tribal wars, the abyssal lack of knowledge, the backward practices. Yahya wants a knowledgeable man to help him restore Islam as a unifying force. Abu Imran, touched by the man's message, writes him a letter and sends him to see a man in Sus called Wajjaj al-Lamti. The letter states the following: if the carrier of the present letter arrives to you, get him from your students someone whose religious knowledge, manners, and advice you trust, that he may teach them the Quran along with the Islamic rulings and guide them to the truth. Doing so will reward you immensely, as Allah does not forget the deeds of the pious. Yahya takes the letter and travels back to Morocco. In 1039, he finds Wajjaj al-Lamti. Wajjaj reads the letter, gathers his students, and picks from them a man called Abdullah ibn Yassin. If you made it this far into the video, well, stick around, things just got interesting. See, Abdullah ibn Yassin was a man of knowledge. He had spent 7 years traveling across Andalusia and studying religious sciences. He decided to put that knowledge to use by helping Yahya ibn Ibrahim in his mission. So the two men set off for the tribes of Lamtuna and Gudala. Abdullah ibn Yassin teaches them the Quran and the manners of the religion. He is at first very well received, but his religious zeal and strict enforcing of the Islamic rulings start to make him enemies. So much so that some of them kick him out of his house and destroy it for good measure. Abdullah's only option left was to flee and save his life. What happens next is blurry in history books and varies from one narrator to the next. There is, however, a narration that can be found in both Tarikh ibn Khaldun and in Ibn Abi Zar's Arawd al-Qirtas, in which Yahya ibn Ibrahim tells Abdullah ibn Yassin about an island located on the river of Senegal where they could live and worship Allah in peace. The two men set off to the island along with 7 other men. Their presence and activities are quickly noticed and start to attract people around them. It is said they gathered 1,000 followers then and there, shortly after. Abdullah ibn Yassin continues tirelessly his teachings, focusing on the basics of the religion. He teaches them how to purify themselves before the prayers, how to do the zakat, how to understand the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, following the understanding of the early generations of Muslims. He then tells his followers about the greatness of paradise, as described in the Holy Quran, describing what Allah prepared in it as a reward for those who struggle in His path. Until one day they said, "We hear and we obey." Ibn Abi Zar in Rawd al-Qirtas recorded a speech he allegedly gave them, and it goes as follows: "O Murabitin, how numerous are you, and Allah rectified your affairs and guided you to the straight path. It is now dutiful upon you to thank Allah for His mercy, to enjoin good, to forbid evil, and to struggle in His path." And this is the end of the first phase of Abdullah ibn Yassin calling towards Islam, where he built the foundation of what would become the Almoravids Empire. We can draw an interesting comparison to the time of the Prophet ﷺ and the Meccan phase, where the focus was on the foundation of the religious principles and practices. And just like in Mecca, preaching by the spoken word could only bring them so far, and Abdullah knew that. Where the word failed to prevail, the sword would succeed. The year is 1059. The Almoravids are knocking at the doors of the infamous Kingdom of Buraghwata. The battle breaks out. Abdullah ibn Yassin, their spiritual leader, suffers heavy injuries. As he is carried back to his war camp, he calls on the senior members of the Almoravids and utters what would be his last words. "O Murabitin, do not despair or lose hope. Help one another on the truth and in the sake of Allah. Do not fight or compete for leadership, for Allah grants dominion to whom He wills. So choose my successor from whom you are pleased, one that will lead your armies, fight your enemies, and fulfill the Islamic obligations." Let us go back in time. 1051. The Almoravids have set their base in the Sagrajas tribe, where they managed to pacify the desert sub-tribes of Lamtuna and Gudala. Abdullah ibn Yassin chooses Yahya ibn Umar, a member of the Banu Targhut, as successor of Yahya ibn Ibrahim, who died in circumstances that are still to this day unclear to historians. In a rapid succession of events, the Moroccan tribes fall into Almoravid rule one after the other. In 1053, they take control of the desert city of Aoudaghost. In 1054, scholars from Sijil Massa send a call for help to Abdullah ibn Yassin to rid them from their unjust rulers. The call is answered on the same year as the Almoravids sweep in and take over the area. In 1055, the Maghrawa region is next on the line. However, things are about to take a turn for the worse. A group of rebels break out in Gudala and Sijil Massa. Yahya ibn Umar and Abdullah ibn Yassin are forced to split their troops. As a result, Yahya ibn Umar is killed in 1056 in the Battle of Tabfarilla, which is arguably the first significant defeat of the Almoravids. Abdullah ibn Yassin appoints then Yahya's brother Abu Bakr ibn Umar as successor. Abu Bakr launches a campaign to pacify the last rebellions in the Sahara Desert. By now, they have managed to control most of the unrest across Morocco, but are still faced with a significant challenge: the Kingdom of Buraghwata. To give some context, we have to go further back in time. In 744 CE, during the caliphate of Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik, a self-professed prophet of a new Judeo-Christian religion by the name of Salih ibn Tarif starts to spread his newfound religion in the region of Tamasna. According to Ibn Khaldun, Salih ibn Tarif claimed to have received a new revelation from God containing 80 chapters, from which some were named after famous prophets like Adam and Noah. In his religion, his followers would fast the month of Rajab instead of Ramadan, they would pray 10 daily prayers instead of the required 5, and they would have no restrictions on the amount of spouses they could take on, while Islam limits it to 4. His grandson, Yunus ibn Ilyas ibn Saleh, took over the torch and carried out this new religion forcefully, even killing over 7,000 people for not adhering to it. Abdullah ibn Yassin and the Almoravids, having rallied the rest of the country, could now shift their attention and focus towards this region. The Buraghwatas boasted a very powerful military force of over 20,000 men. For a long period of time, they managed to thwart any attempt at taking their lands. They were also ruled by a succession of strong leaders who saw to the prosperity of the kingdom. And none of them were interested in military conquest. Instead, they preferred strengthening trade and diplomacy. They also consolidated all the tribes within the kingdom, enabling a long period of peace within their lands. In 1059, they finally head out towards Buraghwata with a strong religious zeal, determined to eradicate from Morocco any trace of this blasphemous religion. And this is when Abdullah ibn Yassin dies from his wounds, while his companions carry on the battle and manage to win it. Abdullah ibn Yassin truly was a remarkable character. From the lowest point of his career as a pariah kicked out from the Saharan tribes, to its peak as the leader of a vast empire, he remained steadfast throughout his life. The bigger the responsibilities, the more humility and khushu' or fear towards Allah he took on. His leadership, teachings and manners gave birth to a whole new generation of Almoravid scholar warriors that would carry on his mission to completion. And this is especially important as we start talking about the life of the next two leaders, Abu Bakr ibn Umar and Yusuf ibn Tashfin, who would carry the banner of the Almoravids as the most successful empire of its time. In our last video, Abdullah ibn Yassin, the charismatic founder of the Almoravids, had just died in the battle against the heretic kingdom of Buraghwata. Abu Bakr ibn Umar, one of the senior members of the Almoravid, was just chosen as the new appointed leader. In 1061, as further rebellions break out in the Saharan tribes, he decides to go back to pacify the region. In his absence, he would appoint Yusuf ibn Tashfin, his best and most trusted man, to lead the northern part of the empire. Now, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to talk about Yusuf ibn Tashfin, because this man is going to be the main protagonist for this series and is relatively unknown even in the Islamic world. And yet, in terms of greatness of character and leadership, there were very few like him. Some historians place him as the 5th Khalifa of Islam, others as 6th, right after Umar ibn Abdulaziz. And this is saying something, because when it comes to Islamic history, the consensus is clear. There were no better caliphs than the first 4 caliphs of Islam. After all, they are not called the rightly guided caliphs for nothing. So, back to the topic at hand. Yusuf ibn Tashfin comes from a long line of leaders from the Lamtuna tribe. He is Yusuf ibn Tashfin, ibn Ibrahim, ibn Turfit, ibn Wartaqtin, ibn Mansur, ibn Masala, ibn Umayyah, ibn Mu'talmi, well, you get the point. Muslims of the time knew their lineage very well, and it was not uncommon at all for people to be able to trace their lineage back 10 generations. But I digress. Yusuf is described as a handsome man. He was brave and generous. But above all, he was extremely pious, and his fear of Allah was the greatest. As a hardened warrior from the desert, he was used to a somewhat rugged life, and had no love for the luxurious and extravagances that the Muslim emirs of Spain indulged into. He considered them weak, having more love for their lavish lifestyle than for the afterlife, to the point where they would even fight each other for territory, even allying Christians against fellow Muslims in some cases. No, Yusuf was different. He did not care much for the worldly life. He dedicated himself above all for the jihad and the pleasure of Allah. His teacher, Abdullah ibn Yassin, had obviously rubbed off on him considerably. His asceticism and love for the jihad are a direct result of Abdullah's teachings. As such, Yusuf adopted a simple lifestyle. He wore clothing made of simple wool and ate food that he prepared with his own hands. At the time, food was not very diverse, so his diet consisted mostly of barley bread, camel meat, and camel milk. And considering he lived close to 100 years in the 11th century, this does not seem like a bad diet at all. So now that we understand a bit who was Yusuf ibn Tashfin, let's get back to the main story. Abu Bakr ibn Umar was getting ready to depart to the Sahara to settle issues between his homeland tribes. Before his trip, he knew he would be gone for a long time, So he divorced his wife, Zainab al-Nafrawiyya, and advised her to marry Yusuf for protection. Zainab was known for her incredible beauty and sharp intellect, her mediation skills, and her beauty even earned her the nickname the Magician. She had been in 3 other marriages before Yusuf, and exclusively married leaders of tribes. Needless to say, she was another remarkable character that I hope we will have the chance to discuss more in details. In the absence of Abu Bakr, Yusuf Ibn Tashfin would shine in strategic, military, and administrative tasks of the empire. Meanwhile, Abu Bakr was pacifying the last rebellions and protecting the south frontiers from the empire of Ghana. Once this matter settled, he came back to the north, expecting to take over the lead from Yusuf. Now, there are a couple of theories to explain the transition of power from Abu Bakr to Yusuf. The first one says that his wife, Zainab, advised him to confront Abu Bakr about the situation gently but firmly and gain his favors with a gift. The second one mentions that the decision was taken after a discussion the two had upon Abu Bakr's return from the Sahara. The first theory implies that Zainab had a say in the politics of the empire and has some weaknesses to it. For starters, these were really tough and challenging times, with men being constantly away dealing with political and military matters. So women would be busy filling the vacuum they left at home. Additionally, we know that later on, Yusuf chose his own son, Ali, as successor. If she really had an influence on the politics of the empire, one would assume that she would have pushed her own son to be successor instead, especially since he was older and an experienced military commander. Therefore, the second theory seems more likely to be the correct one, as it is also completely in line with what their deceased teacher Abdullah ibn Yasin wished on his deathbed: unity and brotherhood in leadership. In the second narration, Yusuf would prepare a welcome back ceremony for Abu Bakr's return, one worthy of kings, where he had his military show off the level of training and organization they had attained during his absence. The two leaders would meet. Yusuf would mount down from his horse, and the two men would sit and start discussing about the future of the Almoravid rule. He would tell him about the needs of the Muslims, the requirements of the next few years. Abu Bakr would have answered the following: "O Yusuf, you are my brother in faith, and the son of my uncle. I do not see a better fit than yourself for the leadership of the country, and I myself long to return to our desert homelands. I only came to hand over the power to you, then I shall be on my way." But Yusuf would not have him go back without a token of recognition for his service and dedication to the Islamic cause. He would prepare for him a royal goodbye gift. And a royal gift it was: 25,000 dinars of gold, 70 Arabian horses, 25 of which were carrying bags of golden jewels, 70 swords, 150 mules, 800 pieces of colored fabric, 100 face veils, 200 suits made of wool, 1,000 pieces of linen, 200 shawls, 150 servants, and the list goes on and on. Yusuf even kept Abu Bakr's name on the coinage of the time as an additional token of appreciation. These two leaders were exemplary patrons of Islam, displaying a high standard of morals and exceptional behavior towards one another. They had no attachment for material things and favored the favors of God instead. They did not let their desires get the better of them. How many leaders have we seen in world history that would have jailed, tortured, or even killed their own brother to stay in power? Their fear of Allah and their love for the religion trumped all of it. Abu Bakr would eventually die just as he wished, in 1077 in a battle hit by a poisoned arrow. Join me next time as we explore the first few formative years of Yusuf's lead that will eventually reach their peak during the unification of the Islamic Emirates of Spain. The year is 1065. Ferdinand I, King of Leon, is ill during the siege of Valencia and dies shortly after. In his will, he divides his kingdom between his 3 sons, Sancho, Alfonso, and Garcia. The eldest, Sancho, would receive Castile. Alfonso would inherit Leon, and Garcia would get the region of Galicia that was carved out for him. But how is any of this related to the Almoravids, you ask? Well, this is the thing about empires. They tend to grow until they inevitably cross paths with neighboring countries. The result is a complicated but fascinating shared history. At the death of their father, a brutal series of wars follows between the three brothers, where Sancho, the eldest, comes out on top. He jails Garcia and wants to do the same with Alfonso. However, Urraca, his sister, pleads for leniency, so Sancho allows him to go on exile. Alfonso takes refuge with his friend Al-Ma'mun, Emir of Toledo, with whom he had a long-standing relationship and who was paying tribute to the Christians for quite some time already. During his stay, Arab sources mention that Alfonso gathered a lot of military information related to the defense of Toledo. One of the narrations by Al-Hajji in his book, Tarikh al-Andalus, reads the following. As he was feigning sleep, Alfonso heard a conversation between Al-Ma'mun and his ministers about the capacity of defense of Toledo and the responsibility of defending it against the Christians' attempts to subdue it, and how they could defend it. At the same time, it appears Alfonso started to plot with his sister Urraca against his elder brother Sancho to have him killed. The plot was a success as Sancho is assassinated in 1072, after which Alfonso takes his position as leader of Castile and Leon. Interestingly, Christian sources do not mention an assassination attempt, but are rather unclear on the whole incident. Arab sources, on the other hand, give a scathing description of Alfonso as an evil man with an insatiable thirst for power. What Alfonso does next actually supports this view. Shortly after the killing of his elder brother, he invites his younger brother Garcia to discuss and debate their differences. As soon as Garcia enters the room, he is arrested and immediately jailed, and he would die there 18 years later in 1090. In 1075, Al-Ma'mun dies and is succeeded by his grandson Al-Qadir. Al-Qadir in Arabic means the powerful, and ironically, we will see that this man was anything but that. Early in his reign, Al-Qadir decides to dispense of the arrangements his grandfather had with Alfonso, perhaps hoping to get the friendship of the emirs in the Taifas around. In response, Alfonso starts sieging the areas around Toledo and imposing unsustainable taxes on him. This does not go well with the people of Toledo, who start rebelling and plotting against Al-Qadir, who they consider to be a puppet of Alfonso. Fearing for his life, Al-Qadir flees to Cuenca. At the same time, the emir of Badajoz or Badajoz, Al-Mutawakkil, Amr ibn Aftas, seizes the opportunity to claim the leadership of Toledo. However, he would fail the task of defending it and would leave the city in 1081. Alfonso would then reinstate Al-Qadir in exchange for even more tribute paid, which would only worsen the burden that the locals were suffering from. 1084, the situation fires up anew as the locals want to get rid of Al-Qadir. This time, the puppet leader would beg Alfonso to interfere and literally siege and take the city. The siege starts in 1084. In May 1085, Alfonso takes the citadel and receives the ambassador of Toledo to discuss the terms of the surrender. According to some Christian sources, those agreements would have been rather generous. Muslims were free to live in the city under Christian rule or to leave with all their possession. Additionally, Toledo's main mosque would not be turned into a church and would be allowed to remain as a place of Muslim worship. The surrender of Toledo is a key moment in history of medieval Spain. According to some Christian sources, the 30 years that follow result in an interesting intermingling of cultures, encouraged by Alfonso VI. This intermingling benefited the Christians the most, as they rapidly became aware of the far more advanced level of knowledge of the Muslim world in medicine, science, and astronomy, which later on spread into Western Europe and encouraged the Italian Renaissance. The period even inspired Toledo 1085, a board game where players take the role of citizens of Toledo working together to advance science and learning. And no, I assure you this is not a sponsor, but if you would like to help, you can subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out the next episodes. The efforts of intermingling that we were talking about were met with stiff resistance from the Christians that were arriving from the north. Shortly after Toledo was taken, the archbishop takes possession of the chief mosque. Accompanied by Christian knights, he enters the mosque, sets up altars, and put bells into the minaret to summon the faithful. Those same Christian sources mention that on hearing this, Alfonso was saddened and angered as he promised the Muslims he would protect their mosque. As you can see, the Arab and Christian sources provide a very contrasted image of Alfonso VI, so it is quite tricky to verify such claims. Later on, further Christian resistance to the convivencia came as a result of the growing influence of the papacy in Spain, which ultimately would lead up to the final expulsion of all Jews and Muslims from Spain at the fall of Granada in 1492. And this is where we come back to our main story. Al-Mutawakkil, Amr ibn al-Aftas, Emir of Badajoz, was increasingly wary of the degrading situation in Muslim Spain. He then sends an envoy to the only ally nearby, Yusuf Ibn Tashfin, the leader of the Almoravid. The call is answered in 1086, as Yusuf prepares his armies and crosses the Detroit of Gibraltar. He gathers more forces from the surrounding Taifas and heads up to Badajoz to meet Alfonso's armies in what would become the legendary Battle of Sagrajas. The losses inflicted on Catholics are so heavy that it is said this battle single-handedly delayed the Reconquista by another 400 years. (1085) Sevilla. The Emir Al-Mu'tamid ibn Abbad takes one final look at his jewel city. He knows that by calling Yusuf ibn Tashfin for help against the Christians that his days as Emir would be counted. His son Rashid advised him against it, but in vain. Ibn Abi Zar and other historians famously recorded his answer. أي يا بني والله لا يسمع عني أبدا أني أعدت الأندلس دار كفر ولا تركتها للنصارى فتقوم علي اللعنة في منابر الإسلام. حرز الجمال والله عندي خير من حرز الخنازير. Yusuf ibn Tashfin had received the envoys from Spain and gotten the call for help. After conferring with his senior advisors, as per the Sunnah of the Prophet, he starts preparing his armies in the city of Ceuta and sent an envoy to the Emir of Sevilla, Al-Mu'tamid, to ask him to prepare Al-Jaziratul Khadra, also known as Al-Khasiras, for him and his troops. Interestingly, it seems the communication between the envoys from Yusuf and the ones from the Emir was difficult as they struggled to understand each other. The Berbers were straight shooters, while the Emirs were used to a more politically charged language that they learned dealing with the Christians. It appears that for some time Al-Mu'tamid tried to play the Almoravid card to Alfonso VI as a threat to get from the Christians what he wanted, while not giving away anything to Yusuf. But Yusuf was not one to entertain this political game of thrones. He knew Alfonso was currently sieging Zaragoza, while Tortosa and Valencia were also under attack. His decision is taken. Along with his troops, he would cross the Strait of Gibraltar with no further delay. The crossing of the Detroit was not without any problem. The sea was very agitated, so much so that Yusuf thought they would not leave to fight the Christians in Spain. Yusuf then famously raised his hands in the sky and supplicated his Lord. اللهم إن كنت تعلم أن في جواز هذا خيرا وصلاحا للمسلمين فسهل علي جواز هذا البحر وإن كان غير ذلك فصعبه علي حتى لا أجوزه. The storm that was raging until then immediately started to calm down. Yusuf took this as a direct response to his supplication and glad tidings for what was to come. Despite the early frictions between the two parties, Yusuf was greatly welcomed by Al-Mu'tamid. His arrival boosted morale of the local Andalusians as they were bracing for battle. They expressed overwhelmingly their relief at the prospect that Yusuf brought with him, a prospect of union of all Muslims under one banner and an end to the division Islamic Spain suffered from for so long. Al-Mu'tamid, thinking that Yusuf and his armies could use a little rest from the travel, invites them over to Sevilla, but Yusuf rebuked him strongly. This was a slap in the face to Al-Mu'tamid. He had rarely seen such steadfastness and iman coming from a fellow Muslim. Few would refuse an invitation to the luxurious palaces of Sevilla. Additionally, Yusuf was over 70 years old at the time and had just accomplished quite a dangerous and tiresome trip. This exemplary behavior alone granted him immediate legitimacy in the eyes of the Andalusians as the undisputed leader of the Muslims. As a result, all emirs joined forces under Yusuf's lead. Al-Mu'tamid from Sevilla was the first to join, followed by the emir of Almeria, then Abdullah ibn Balkin, the emir of Granada, then his brother Tamim, the emir of Malaga. The troops departed and headed towards Badajoz, where they were welcomed by Al-Mutawakkil Amr ibn al-Aftas. They kept going north to the borders of current-day Portugal, until they reached a plain that would be remembered as the plain of Zallaqa. In that plain would the Muslim Taifas unite for the first time since the fall of the Umayyads, which at the time seemed quite the miracle. The different sources we have on the battle differed when it comes to the number of participants. A first source states 24,000 Andalusians and 24,000 Almoravids. A second source mentions that Yusuf crossed the Strait of Gibraltar with 7,000 men, to what we can add another 20,000 men from Al-Andalus. Ibn Kardabus, in his Tarikh al-Andalus, mentions 20,000 Almoravids. So we can deduce from these sources that the Muslims in total were at least 20,000 and at most 45,000. However, all sources agree that the Muslims had fewer troops than the Christians. Before the fight, a couple of interesting events are happening. The first one is when Yusuf sent, in accordance with the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, a letter to Alfonso giving him one of three options: convert to Islam, pay the jizya, or war, which Alfonso understandably refused. On the other hand, multiple sources mention that Alfonso sent an envoy to Yusuf Ibn Tashfin on a Thursday, which said the following, quote, "Tomorrow is Friday and is your holiday. Saturday is the Sabbath of the Jews and Sunday is our holiday. Let us meet on the battlefield on Monday." The Muslims understand this to be a blatant trick and they get ready to fight on Friday. Indeed, on Friday early morning around Fajr prayer, the Christian armies were knocking at the door. The formation of the Muslim troops was as follows. The front line was led by Al-Mu'tamid with 10,000 troops on horseback. The right flank was led by Al-Mutawakkil Amr ibn al-Aftas. The left flank was composed of the eastern Andalusian troops. The reserves were led by Yusuf Ibn Tashfin with a select few from the Almoravids and their own troops. On the other side, the Christians were split into four different groups: a front line, two wings, and a center of formation that was led by Alfonso himself. The battle starts. The Christians' heavily armored horsemen lead a strong charge into the Muslim front line. Al-Mu'tamid is injured. Alfonso leads another charge on the Almoravid regiment led by Dawood ibn Aisha. This last attack increases further the pressures on the forces of Al-Mu'tamid and Abu Dawood. When Yusuf hears of the news, he sends a regiment of strong Almoravid warriors led by Sir ibn Abu Bakr, which managed to relieve some of the pressure. Alfonso still manages to push all the way up to the Almoravid camp. At the site, the Christians were rejoicing. Meanwhile, Yusuf was preparing his next move that would turn the tides of the battle in favor of the Muslims. The reserve troops that Yusuf kept aside start walking to the rhythms of the drums and flanked the pushing Christians when they least expected it. This attack is devastating as the Almoravids sweep through the Christians, killing anyone on their path. The surviving Christians flee towards Alfonso, who orders them to stand their ground and fight. But the Christians are in a very unfavorable position and are forced to retreat with less than 1,000 men. One of Yusuf's men tracks Alfonso and manages to injure him on the calf, an injury that he would carry for the rest of his life. The Christians are routed and the Muslims are victorious. Later on, historians would compare this battle to the Battle of Yarmouk or the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah. Yusuf would have to go back prematurely to Morocco as he received news his son had died, which prevented the Almoravids from capitalizing on this battle further. Not only would Yusuf come back for more victories, but he would also take the entirety of Islamic Spain under his empire. The year is 1088. The Almoravids are sieging the fort of Aledo in the province of Murcia. The supply lines are disrupted and winter is coming. Moreover, news of Alfonso VI advancing towards the fort with additional troops had reached the Muslims. The situation is critical, and Yusuf decides to lift the siege. Alfonso VI, on arriving, reckons the defense of the fort cannot survive another siege. He saves the surviving Christians and sacks the fort before abandoning it. The year is 1088. The Almoravids are sieging the fort of Aledo in the province of Murcia. The supply lines are disrupted and winter is coming. Moreover, news of Alfonso VI advancing towards the fort with additional troops had reached the Muslims. The situation is critical, and Yusuf decides to lift the siege. Alfonso VI, on arriving, reckons the defense of the fort cannot survive another siege. He saves the surviving Christians and sacks the fort before abandoning it. Let us go back a few months. It is 1087, and despite the crushing Muslim victory at the Battle of Sagrajas in 1086, and the many recommendations Yusuf had given the emirs, gambling, drinking, and disputes for leadership became the norm once again. At the same time, news of the return of Yusuf to North Africa had reached Alfonso. Now was the time to act, he reckoned. He sends a call to his allied Crusader states for help against the Almoravids. The states of Genoa and Pisa respond to the call with 400 boats, with close to 12,000 soldiers. The Crusader forces land on the eastern coast of the peninsula and start raiding the east of the Andalusian Emirates. They know that the Almoravids under Sir Abu Bakr were further west in the Emirates of Badajoz and Sevilla. The Crusader then take hold of the strategic fort of Aledo, in the province of Murcia. From there, they build a base in the heartland of the Islamic territory and start to lead raids on the nearby cities. Al-Mu'tamid knew what he had to do. The only thing that he could do, rush back to North Africa to ask Yusuf Ibn Tashfin yet again for help. Yusuf, conscious of his religious duty to protect his fellow Muslim brothers, would graciously accept and start preparing his armies once more for battle. The Almoravids land in Algeciras. From there, Yusuf calls on to the emirs of the different states with the first objective: siege the fort of Aledo and chase the Christians from their territory. Al-Mu'tamid of Sevilla joins with his armies, followed by the emir of Malaga, Tamim ibn Balkin, and his brother Abdullah ibn Balkin, emir of Granada. Al-Mu'tasim ibn Samada, the emir of Murcia, is the last to join the war efforts. The Muslims this time brought catapults for the siege. The projectiles start flying and crash on the walls of the fortified castle. But the Christians are well prepared and have enough supplies stocked up to hold the attack. Not to mention, the mountainous terrain makes it really difficult to move siege equipment around, which gives a natural advantage to the defenders. The siege lasted 4 months. During that time, the emirs argued and complained to Yusuf against one another, and among the major disputes was the one between Al-Mu'tamid of Sevilla and Ibn Rashiq of Murcia. Ibn Rashiq was fighting Al-Mu'tamid over his city's independence, but Al-Mu'tamid presented evidence that Ibn Rashiq had contacted the Christians for help against him, and was actually paying tribute to Alfonso VI. Apparently this fact was known to all emirs. The evidence stacked up against Ibn Rashiq, but Yusuf was not one to take justice in his own hands. He handed over the case to the fuqaha so they could provide him with a ruling from the Islamic jurisprudence. And justice was served. Ibn Rashiq was to be jailed under Al-Mu'tamid, but his life would be spared. Upon hearing the news, Ibn Rashiq's followers were furious and cut the supply line that was used to provide food to the Muslims. The situation became critical. Not only were the supply lines disrupted, but winter was coming, and Yusuf's informants gave the news of Alfonso's troops heading their way. Yusuf had a decision to make. The last thing they needed was to deal with attacks coming from 2 different fronts. So after 4 months, he decides to lift the siege and retreat to the city of Lorca. Alfonso then enters the fort and realizes they are in no position to hold it for much longer. He then orders his troops to sack the fort and abandon it to the Muslims. All things considered, the siege is a small win for the Muslims, as their primary goal of removing the Christians' presence from Muslim territory was accomplished. However, Yusuf was not happy with the result. His overarching goal still remains to liberate all of Spain from the Christians. Plus, this 4-month operation only increased his conviction that the emirs of Spain were not fit for leadership, and had no other interest than remaining on their thrones. At the same time, the Andalusians' love for Yusuf's manners and noble character grew stronger. And not unlike a lot of the early Muslim conquest, the Muslims conquered the hearts of the locals first by bringing justice to an otherwise oppressed population. Now, armed with a legal ruling from the fuqaha of Al-Andalus, the stage is set for Yusuf and the Almoravids to fully take control of Islamic Spain in the next few years. Now firmly in control of all of Northwest Africa and Islamic Spain, the military might of the Almoravids was at its peak. Interestingly, the Abbasid Khalifa in Baghdad, at the time of the Almoravids, was Al-Mustasir, and was completely irrelevant politically. He barely ruled over his own city. Yusuf could have just as well decided that the Khalif in Baghdad, drowning in his love for alcohol and women, was no longer fit for rulership, and the Almoravids could have walked to Baghdad and taken control of the whole Muslim Ummah. However, Yusuf was not one to take such matters lightly. According to Ibn Khaldun, he even wrote a letter to the Caliph declaring his allegiance to him, out of respect for the Caliphate and to keep a united front. Unfortunately, we have seen many times in history rising Muslim dynasties attacking their brothers in faith under false pretext. But Yusuf would not be one of them. These are the words that Yusuf left the emirs before going back to North Africa after the siege of Aledo. Those words, just like after the Battle of Sagrajas, were very well received, but with little effect. By now, Yusuf Ibn Tashfin had crossed the Strait of Gibraltar 2 times already, one time at the Battle of Sagrajas and one time during the siege of Aledo. And if you haven't watched these episodes yet, it is important that you do to understand the events that we will be discussing now. Let us rewind a bit. We know from our last episode that the Emir of Sevilla and Mu'tamid took advantage of the situation during the siege of Aledo to get rid of Ibn Rashiq and get his hands on Murcia and its region. Yusuf's general approach towards the emirs was to judge them based on their apparent actions, even if he knew very well about their secret dealings with the Christians. His goal was to make their treachery visible to the general public, so that he could use that as a clear and acceptable evidence for the time when he would eventually overthrow them. He would get such an opportunity in 1090, when he decides to siege the city of Toledo. Not only did the emirs not welcome him on his third intervention in Iberia, they outright abstained from joining the siege efforts. Yusuf, realizing the situation could backfire on him, lifts the siege. At this point, it was pretty clear that the only solution left for Yusuf was to take over from the corrupt emirs. But again, this is not something that he took lightly. He gave the emirs all the benefit of the doubt that one could possibly give, until it became impossible to object to the scholars' clear verdict. The emirs were not fit for leadership, and Yusuf's duty towards the Ummah was to take them out. And this can get political. Some may say that it wasn't Yusuf's call to make. But then you may ask the same about other famous takeover in Islamic history. Was Nur ad-Din Mahmud, leader of the Seljuk Empire in the 12th century, wrong to take over Damascus from its Muslim corrupt leaders? Was Salahuddin al-Ayyubi an unjust aggressor when he took control and unified Egypt and Syria and kicked out the Crusaders from those lands? All these are interesting questions, but we will not be delving into the politics and will restrict ourselves to analyze the facts. And the facts are that Yusuf was not going to do anything until he was absolutely certain that what he would do would benefit the Muslim Ummah and was in line with Islamic rulings. We Muslims are all too aware of the following hadith from Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that says, "Whoever rejects lawful obedience to the leader and divides the community and dies in the state will have died upon ignorance." And Yusuf admirably and humbly demonstrated his awareness of these rulings. Despite the might of the Almoravid under Yusuf at that time, he was all too weary about keeping a united front. He decides to send an emissary to Baghdad, led by Abu Bakr Atiq ibn Imran, the judge of the city of Ceuta. The emissary managed to reach the Khalifa in Baghdad, Al-Muqtadi bi Amrillah, who ruled from 1075 to 1094. However, on his return from Baghdad, he was killed in Alexandria in 1091 by the leader of the Fatimid Shia dynasty that controlled most of Egypt. Shortly after, Al-Muqtadi bi-Amrillah dies and is succeeded by his 16-year-old son Al-Mustasir. Yusuf sends another embassy to him along with lavish gifts, and a letter where he describes their military successes in Iberia. This second embassy was led by Muhammad ibn al-Arabi and son, and was instrumental in propagating the news about the Almoravids' role in retaking territory in Iberia, pushing back the Crusaders. They even went on a pilgrimage to Mecca to pray and supplicate for the Almoravids, and prayed in the prophetic mosque in Al-Madinah al-Munawwara. The famous historian Ibn Khaldun mentions that they met the great Imam of that time, the likes of Imam al-Ghazali in Baghdad and Imam al-Tartushi in Alexandria, and then returned from Baghdad with a document in which the Khalifa officially recognizes Ibn Tashfin's rule over the Maghrib. In this document, the Khalifa addressed Ibn Tashfin as Commander of the Muslims, in order to honor him for his accomplishments. But most importantly, this second embassy to Baghdad gave Yusuf Ibn Tashfin all the legal rulings that he needed, most notably from Imam al-Ghazali and Imam al-Tartushi, to depose the corrupt Muslim emirs of Spain. We still have today the full letter from Imam al-Tartushi sent to Yusuf, where the Imam gives his advice on being a just ruler, advice taken from the Quran and the numerous prophetic ahadith. He opens his letter with Surah Sa'd, verse 26 from the Holy Quran. This is the story of how the city-state of Granada, led by Abdullah ibn Balkin, fell to the Almoravids. This event has not only been recorded by historians like Ibn Khaldun, but as well by the Emir Abdullah himself. After his deposition at the hands of Yusuf Ibn Tashfin, he wrote a book called Tibyan al-Hada'it biduwal Bani Ziri fi Granada. The title of the book translates into Events of the State of Banu Ziri in Granada. In it, he narrates events that happened during his reign, and most interestingly for us, he tells us about the times when the Almoravids sieged the city and forced him out. The year is 1090, and Alfonso is slowly recovering from the crushing defeat at the Battle of Sagrajas in 1086 at the hands of the Muslim armies of Yusuf Ibn Tashfin. Ever since the battle, the taxes that he would normally impose on the emirs had stopped coming in, and he was in no position to get them. In 1090, however, he sends his right man to Abdullah ibn Balkin, the emir of Granada, asking him for tributes and taxes for all 3 years since the battle, during which they were understandably not levied. Abdullah ibn Balkin submits to the request, as if the Battle of Sagrajas never happened. This shameful submission enraged the local Muslim citizens of Granada, so much that they started plotting against Ibn Balkin. To this day, we have poems of the time describing the discontent of the locals. At the time, Yusuf was remaining in Ceuta. Being the border city that he was, it allowed him to remain close to his informants from Spain, which told him of every move from the emir with the Christians. Most notably, Abu Ja'far al-Qali'i, judge of Granada, is recorded to have played a big role in the public opposition to the emir. Irritated by the news that kept coming up to him, Yusuf Ibn Tashfin meets Al-Mu'tamid in Sevilla. After gathering evidence about the treachery of Ibn Balkin with the Christians, something had to be done. And for this part, we will turn to the book of Ibn Balkin himself and quote the emir directly. Let me add this quick disclaimer before that. The pictures that you'll see in the book are AI generated, and they're not meant to be accurate description of the times. Abdullah ibn Balkin writes, quote, "The Emir of the Muslims, Yusuf ibn Tashfin, sent us a letter in which he stated, 'Come to us now, and do not make us wait 1 hour too much.' I excused myself from the order and sent instead 2 envoys, which the Emir promptly jailed, after telling them, 'By Allah, I shall wage war onto him, just like we waged war onto Alfonso.'" End quote. The wrath of the emir was something to behold, Shortly after, he sends back the two envoys who apparently were roughed up a little during their stay, along with his most capable soldiers, to let the Emir of Granada know about the situation. And Yusuf was not one to make empty claims. Shortly after, his armies were knocking at the gates of Granada. Abdullah ibn Balkin continues, quote, "The Emir then sent an army to Granada as an effort to siege the city and prevent Christian forces from entering it. I decided then to send some of my fuqaha to the Emir with money, to let him know that I consider myself as his own son, and that I would not oppose anything he did. Whatever he willed, I would obey." We heard back from the Emir's faqih Ibn Sa'dun, who brought a letter written by the Emir's own hands, in which he guarantees safe passage to him and his family without his possessions. At the end of the letter, Yusuf says the following, quote, "If you surrender, you can select a place from your kingdom outside Granada in which you will remain until we decide of your case." End quote. Now, Abdullah ibn Balkin even tells us of the situation inside Granada during the siege that lasted 2 months. He continues, quote, "When we turned to our people, we found out that the reactions to the situations were not unanimous. The Berber soldiers in our armies felt somewhat proud to be delivered by the Berber Almoravids. All agreed not to fight back, and to send letters expressing obedience, to which Yusuf answered that they were safe and could remain in their positions in the military under his command. The traders and inhabitants of the land would side with whomever came out the leader after the siege, as they had no desire nor capabilities to fight. Finally, the farmers, which were the pillars of the economy, were the first to obey the new ruler." End quote. Abdullah ibn Balkin was surrounded and had no option left. He surrendered himself and all his possessions to the Almoravids. And so, in 1090, the Almoravids entered the jewel city of Granada. He continues, quote, "Upon meeting Yusuf Ibn Tashfin, he assured us once again for my family and myself security and respectful treatment to save what little dignity there was left. He then ordered that we were to be surveilled until he made sure that we would be true to our word." Yusuf Ibn Tashfin entered the palace of Granada and remained there for some time, the time it took to clean house. Most notably, he removed all taxes imposed on locals and kept in place only what the Islamic law legislated, the zakat and the charity. The people of Granada welcomed the news with great relief. And so, Granada was the first Spanish city the Almoravids took over, but wouldn't be the last. Abdullah was then given 300 dinars, 3 servants, and 5 cattle for the upcoming trip. He was moved to Algeciras, accompanied by a small group of Almoravids, where he remained for some time, after what they moved him to Ceuta. He writes that he spent his time praying and asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that his deeds may be forgiven. From there, he was moved to Meknes, where Yusuf's companion, the famous Sir Ibn Abu Bakr, was waiting for him. He writes that he received a letter from the commander of the Muslims himself, a letter in which Yusuf made his heart at ease and addressed him in a beautiful and respectful manner, despite having done what he has done. The Emir of the Muslims, Yusuf Ibn Tashfin, has returned to Marrakesh after the take of Granada and has led his most capable man, Sir Ibn Abi Bakr, in charge of Al-Andalus. The Emir returned to check on his people, as was the custom for responsible Muslim leaders. We have many narrations from the era of the Khulafa al-Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphs, describing the Khalifa walking down the streets of his city at night to check on his people. And Yusuf was no different. He would walk down the streets of his city, listen to the complaints of the oppressed, and would check the behavior and manners of his workers and judges, until he made completely sure that things were running smooth and he had his people's trust. It was now time to address the military concerns once again. As we mentioned previously, Yusuf had moved his base for military operations to Ceuta in 1091 in order to remain in close contact with his soldiers and informants. He started making plans for the full takeover of the remaining Taifas, the Muslim city-states of Spain. He divided the map as follows. Sir Ibn Abi Bakr was in charge of Sevilla and Badajoz, which were still led respectively by Al-Mu'tamid ibn Abbad and Al-Mutawakkil ibn al-Aftas. Remember, these two were the ones that called out the Almoravids for help against Alfonso when things were going south for them, and they participated in the Battle of Sagrajas in 1086. Apparently, this did not prevent them from making further deals with Alfonso. Abu Abdullah ibn al-Hajj was in charge of taking over Cordoba, which was led at the time by Al-Ma'mun, son of Al-Mu'tamid. A third army led by Jurur al-Hamashi was tasked to take over the city of Ronda, which was led by yet another son of Al-Mu'tamid, Yazid al-Radi. Finally, Abu Zakaria ibn Wasinu was in charge of taking over Almeria from Al-Mu'tasim ibn Sumadih, which is the focus of today's episode. Now let's pause a bit and talk about Al-Mu'tasim ibn Sumadih. His family ruled independently in Almeria since 1041, and he inherited the rule in 1051 as a young boy under the regency of his uncle. Al-Mu'tasim was a poet. He enjoyed the good life and spent most of his reign on evenings of drinking and poetry. He surrounded his court with poets that would sing his praises. Needless to say, he was not ready for what was coming. And so, one day he receives the news of the takeover of Granada at the hands of the Almoravids, and the surrender of Abdullah ibn Balkin. The news rocked him like a raging storm rocks a sinking ship. And when Yusuf Ibn Tashfin summoned him to Granada, not only does he not show up, he even became sick out of fear. Shortly after, the armies of Yusuf Ibn Tashfin under Abu Zakaria ibn Wasinu were at the gates of the city. The Emir of Almeria knew his reign had come to an end, and his days were counted as his sickness got worse and worse. He had to act swiftly. He made his son Mu'izz ad-Dawla Emir in his stead and tells him the following words: "Run to Sevilla and stay there as long as you can. If you see Al-Mu'tamid leave the city, then do not stay there another hour. Take to the sea and never come back." Mu'izz ad-Dawla listened to his father's advice, and at his death, he ran to Sevilla, stayed there for 6 months until the Almoravids started sieging the city. He then returned to Almeria, took one of his father's boats, and put on it as many possessions as he possibly could. However, the locals were aware of his plans and prevented his escape. There was only one option left. He surrendered to the emir and brought to him lavish gifts. Details on how the events unfolded are a bit unclear, but what we know for sure is that he somehow managed to escape by a boat and took refuge in the Algerian coast, in the lands of Banu Hammad. And so the Almoravids entered the city and raised their flag. On it were written the following words from the Holy Quran:
ومن يبتغ غير الإسلام دينا فلن يقبل منه وهو في الآخرة من الخاسرين.
The series will continue with the deposition of the emirs of Cordoba, Sevilla, and Badajoz, and the consolidation of power at the hands of the Almoravids. Let's do a quick recap. It's 1090, and the Almoravids have put their hands on Malaga, Granada, and Almeria, along with their surrounding regions. Ever since the take of Granada, Al-Mu'tamid of Sevilla started to feel uneasy about the presence of the Almoravids in Spain. He knew he was next on their radar. Now, before getting into the crux of the matter, we have to lay out the context and talk about the Emir of Sevilla and his kingdom. Because his was a very unique kingdom, and he was a very unique king. First of all, the territory was significantly bigger as it covered from current-day South Portugal to southeast of Toledo. Al-Mu'tamid himself was quite different from the others, and we could do a whole series on his reign due to the sheer complexity of his character. He was a poet, as were some of the Taifa kings. And yes, he did enjoy the evenings of drinking and partying. He was loved to death by his court and followers. On the political front, he exerted significant influence over the other Taifa kings, and was as ruthless as it gets. On the battlefield, he was very brave and a fine strategist. In Sagrajas, for example, he stood his ground firmly against the heavy charges of Alfonso's knights. So, as you can see, he was far from the stereotype of the drunken poet and sexual deviant we have in mind when thinking of the emirs of the Taifas. However, when looking at his political decisions, we can understand the reasons that led to his deposition. It appears he carries the responsibility for a lot of the trouble which happened during that period. For starters, he has been paying tribute to Alfonso VI for a while, and was always on the lookout to get more deals with him. A prime example of this would be his involvement during the siege of Toledo in 1085. Another example would be in 1070, when coming to the rescue of the Emir of Cordoba, who was attacked by the Emir of Toledo. He ruthlessly took advantage of the situation to add Cordoba to his realm and depose its ruler. While all of this was happening, his nights of drinking and partying just kept going. We even have poems of his in which he describes, in rather honest words, the whole scene. Now, with the context laid out, let's dive into the event at hand. We previously mentioned that Yusuf Ibn Tashfin had summoned the Taifa kings after the take of Granada to discuss the situation in Al-Andalus. Al-Mu'tamid responded to the call to give his respect to the Emir of the Muslims. The wrath of the Emir was palpable, and Al-Mu'tamid left the city scared to death. He rushed back to Sevilla and literally started to pack his things. Yusuf's informant kept him up to date, so he sent one of his men, Shurur al-Hamashi, to deliver a message. Al-Amir يحتاج إلى تذكارك بعد الأمر, he said. The Emir needs to remind you of certain affairs. But nothing could change his mind. Al-Mu'tamid rushed to Cordoba, where he met Ibn al-Aftas of Badajoz and told him, أنجو بنفسك فقد ترى محل بصاحب غرناطة وغدا بنا. Save yourself. Haven't you seen what happened to the Emir of Granada and tomorrow to us? Yusuf Ibn Tashfin sent another envoy to remind him of their arrangement. And Yusuf, while doing so, was watching Al-Mu'tamid's reaction and gathering more evidence to build his case against him. Al-Mu'tamid started to take practical steps to strengthen the defense of the city. His son told him, ألم أقل لك يا أبتي يخرجنا هذا الصحراوي من بلادنا إن أنت أوردته علينا. Did I not warn you, O father, that this desert Bedouin will kick us out of our city if you called upon him? To which Al-Mu'tamid responded with a popular saying, يا بني لا ينجي حذر من قدر, which basically translates to, warnings do not save from reality. At this point, the message was now clear for both parties. Al-Mu'tamid was not going to go down without a fight, whatever it took. He reaches out to Alfonso as a last-ditch attempt to save his kingdom. His letters are intercepted by Yusuf's guards, after what the Emir of the Muslims sends yet another warning to Al-Mu'tamid to not cooperate with their common enemy. We have to take a pause here and commend Yusuf Ibn Tashfin for the remarkable patience and wisdom shown dealing with Al-Mu'tamid. He gave him every chance to come back to the ranks of the Muslims and the benefit of every doubt. But at this point, the evidence stacked up to a point of no return. The fuqaha of Yusuf were categorical. Al-Mu'tamid had to be taken down. So Yusuf put himself to task. He started by sending letters to the surrounding areas of the Kingdom of Sevilla, to the people directly, requesting from them that they joined the Almoravids and made themselves free from the wrongdoings of Al-Mu'tamid, to which most favorably responded. And remember, at this time, Yusuf Ibn Tashfin is still in Ceuta, from where he oversees the situation. He starts then working on a full-fledged plan for the takeover. In the meanwhile, defense preparations in Cordoba were going strong, led by Al-Ma'mun ibn al-Mu'tamid. His father had fired him up for the defense, telling him, لا تجزع فالموت أهون من الظلم وليس السلطان إلا من القصر إلى القبر. Do not be afraid, for death is better than humiliation, and life of the kings only goes from the palace to the tomb. The Almoravids had surrounded and led the siege to the city, and at its head was the companion Abi Abdullah ibn al-Hajj. They managed to get into the city, and Al-Ma'mun, son of Al-Mu'tamid, is killed in the battle that ensues. And so they entered Cordoba in 1091 and wrested control over the surrounding regions. Al-Mu'tamid was now left with only Ronda, Sevilla, and Martella to the west. The strategy laid out by Yusuf Ibn Tashfin was to encircle Sevilla for a final siege to the city. And so, another son of Al-Mu'tamid, Yazid al-Radi, is killed in the siege of Ronda, and the emir of Martella swiftly surrenders. After making sure to win over the areas around Sevilla, the siege around the capital of Al-Mu'tamid is laid out. But still, the cunning emir of Sevilla is not done. He dispatches envoys to Alfonso VI to ask him for help, promising him his kingdom, to which the Christian king responds by sending 20,000 knights and 10,000 troops. And when the companion Sir ibn Abi Bakr hears of the movements of the Christians, he assigns troops of his own from the best warriors of the Almoravids to meet them halfway and prevent them from entering Sevilla. 10,000 riders from the Almoravids are sent to the front at the castle of Almodovar. The war that ensues, as you could imagine, is bloody and heavy casualties are felt on both sides. And I could not find many sources documenting this battle, so it is tricky to really know the details, but what we know for sure is that the Almoravids ultimately defeat the Christians. And all of this is happening while Al-Mu'tamid is in his castle in Sevilla, dreading what was coming for him. The siege lasted for a period of 4 months, during which the Sevillians started to switch allegiance and revolted against Al-Mu'tamid. During the chaos that follows, a breach in the walls is opened, and the Almoravids take advantage and go in. Al-Mu'tamid is captured, and him and his family are given a guarantee of safety, despite all the trouble that he had caused. Al-Mu'tamid is then moved to the Maghreb region, first for a short stay in Tangier, then to his final destination, the city of Ahmad, nearby Marrakesh. He would finish his days there in 1095. He spent the last few years of his life writing poems. He wrote about his sorrows and his memories of life in the jewel city of Sevilla. Make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon. Consider liking, commenting, or sharing. It would help immensely. See you next time.